Scene 7. The word he had been waiting for. New Smyrna Colony. Winter 1776 into spring 1777. The good years had been the most dangerous thing. Francisco understood this now, in the way you understand something only after it has already done its damage. Between 1771 and 1773, the indigo had come in well, thick stands of it across the cleared fields, the 3-vat system running from June to September, the processed bricks going out on the wharves with a regularity that felt, briefly, like proof that the original idea had been sound. The death rate had fallen. Children were being born into the colony who had never known anything else, which was its own particular fact to sit with. But the births were happening and the graves were being dug less often. And there was a period, 2 years, perhaps 2.5, when a man could almost construct an argument that this was going to be all right. Francisco had not constructed the argument, but he had watched others construct it, and he had not corrected them, and perhaps that was the same thing. Then the droughts came. 1773, and again 1775. The indigo parched in the ground, the yields collapsing, the partners in London refusing to fund emergency food imports, because the accounts were already beyond what anyone had planned for. Turnbull had ended the clothing supply to cut costs. Grown men and women working Florida fields in what they could piece together from what they owned, which was almost nothing. The death rate climbed back to where it had been in the early years. The graves opened again in the sandy soil that showed no record of what it held. By the winter of 1776 into 1777, Francisco had been at New Smyrna for 8.5 years. He was 29 years old. When he tried to remember the 21-year-old who had stood on the bank of Mosquito Inlet with his boots in his hand and looked at this clearing for the first time, he found he could not quite locate him. Could not find the seam where that person ended and this one began. 9 years had a way of making the before feel like someone else's life. His daughter Juana had been born on the 16th of December, 1776. He had been building a drainage ditch extension at the south end of the 3rd field when Margarita's time came, and one of the older women had found him there and told him. And he had put down his tools and walked back and been told by an overseer, through the medium of a cane pointed at the field, that the work did not stop because a man's wife was in labor. He had kept walking. The overseer had shouted. Francisco had not stopped or looked back, and after a moment, the shouting had stopped too, because the overseer had made the same calculation he always made. The arithmetic of what it cost to make an example of a man who was also the colony's most skilled carpenter, and found the numbers didn't favor it. He had held Juana in his hands in the palmetto frond hut that had been their home for 8 years. She was very small. She looked at him with the unfocused expression of a person newly arrived in a world whose terms she had not yet been told. He had 2 children born at this colony. Both of them had signed no contract. Both of them had not crossed any ocean under any promise. They were here because he was here, and he was here because of a paper he had signed in Minorca when he was 20 years old, and did not yet know what Florida looked like in August. His contract, by any reasonable reading, had already expired. The Minorcans believed their indenture ran 9 years from the date of arrival. 9 years from August 1768 was August 1777. Turnbull held a different view, that the 9-year clock did not begin until the plantation's debts were fully paid, which was a calculation designed to have no end point, a horizon that retreated as you walked toward it. Francisco had understood this for years. He had watched other men go to request their discharge, men whose contracts, by any arithmetic that did not belong to Turnbull, had clearly expired, and come back with things broken in them that had not been broken before. One man had been made to sign for 4 more years under duress, in the presence of an overseer whose cane made the nature of the choice clear. Another had been put in irons for a week as a lesson in the difference between what the contract said and what the overseers enforced. Francisco had not gone to request his discharge. He was not a coward. He was a carpenter, and carpenters do not put a nail until the wood is properly positioned. He had been waiting for something, though he had not been able to name what he was waiting for. Not permission, not opportunity. Opportunity had existed for years, in the theoretical sense that a man could always walk into a swamp and die there. Something else. Something that would make the mathematics complete. The Englishmen came in February. They came from St. Augustine, officials of some kind, inspectors perhaps, men with clipboards, and the expressions of people conducting an assessment they already know the conclusion of. They walked through the settlement with Turnbull's overseer and made notes and spoke in English among themselves and largely ignored the people working around them, which was the standard arrangement and which suited everyone on all sides. A boy saw them. He was perhaps 10 or 11. Francisco did not know his name, knew the mother slightly, knew the family by the hut they occupied at the far end of the second row. The boy had been carrying water that afternoon and had stopped near the group of Englishmen and stood longer than he should have. The way children will when adults are speaking in a way that seems important. What the boy heard, he brought home to his mother. What he heard, or what he understood of it, filtered through the imperfect English of a child who had grown up in a settlement where English was the overseer's language, the language of canes and orders, was something like, if these people knew their rights under English law, they would not suffer this. It was a casual remark, an aside between men conducting an inspection, one official to another, the kind of thing said in passing that the speaker had already forgotten by dinner time. It was not directed at anyone. It was not an offer or an invitation. It was simply an observation made by a man who understood the law and was troubled, in a mild and uncomplicated way, by what he saw. The boy told his mother. The mother told 3 women. By the time the words reached Francisco, they had passed through perhaps 15 people and 2 partial translations, and had been compressed by the journey into something simpler and more urgent than the original. What reached him was this: English law says our contracts have ended. We have the right to leave. He sat with it, not with excitement, with the quiet of a man who has been handed a tool he recognizes, who has been looking for this particular tool for a long time and has finally found it in an unexpected drawer. He already knew the contracts had expired. He had known this for months, by any calendar that did not belong to Turnbull. What the boy's words gave him was not new information. What they gave him was something else. They gave him the frame. A man who runs is a fugitive. A man who walks away from a debt that has been paid, who presents himself to the proper authority and requests what is lawfully his. That man is not a fugitive. He is a petitioner. He is a subject of the British Crown, exercising a right under English law. He is, of all the things Francisco had tried to be for 9 years, something he had not managed to locate a word for until now. He was free, not yet in practice, but in the architecture of the thing, in the legal structure, the way a building is a building before its walls are raised, he was free and had been, and Turnbull had been holding him past the end of what the contract permitted. Francisco drove a nail, and another. He kept his face empty and his pace steady because he had spent 9 years learning that the overseers watch the face more than the hands. He began to plan. It took 3 weeks. Not because the plan was complicated, the plan was simple, a straight line north along the King's Road, a request for an audience at Government House, a set of words he had been assembling for years in the private structure of his own mind. The 3 weeks were for the other thing, the harder thing. Finding the 2 men he trusted enough to bring, establishing the signal that would tell him they were willing, working out the cover story that would get them as far as the coast before anyone asked questions. The cover story was turtle hunting. It was a thin story, a story that would survive 1 question, and possibly 2, but not 3. And Francisco knew this and used it anyway, because the alternatives were thinner. One evening in late March, he confirmed it with the 2 men he had chosen. Juan Genoply had been at the colony since the beginning, 8.5 years, the same as Francisco. He was Menorcan, perhaps 5 years older, with the deliberate patience of a man who had survived this long by spending every available resource on the internal rather than the external. He did not complain. He did not make speeches. He went to his work and came home from it and kept his own counsel, which was, in Francisco's estimation, the most valuable quality a man could have in a place where everything you said could be used against you. They had worked side by side on the canal extensions in the early years, and Francisco had learned to read him the way a carpenter reads grain, watching for the small signs, the places where a man's surface tells you something about his structure beneath. What he had seen in Genoply was this: a man who had not broken, who had made the daily calculation that survival was the best form of resistance available to him, and who had arrived. Francisco could see it in the last months, in something that had shifted in the eyes. At the limit of that calculation, Antonio Lambias was younger, perhaps 25, a Corsican who had come over on one of the middle ships and whose people had settled in the Greek section of the colony by accident of assignment and had stayed because there was nowhere else to go. He was not the obvious choice. He was quick-tempered in the way of young men who have been insulted too many times, too consistently, which made him a risk. But Francisco had watched him for 3 years, specifically because of that quality. Watched how he managed it. Watched the moments when the temper came to the surface and what Lambias did with it. What he did was close his mouth and breathe and put it away. A man who can do that in the conditions of this colony, Francisco had decided, can be trusted with something that requires absolute steadiness. He spoke to each of them separately and briefly, in the gap between the end of the workday and the evening check. To Genoply in Menorcan, to Lambias in the Italian-inflected Spanish that had become the colony's private lingua franca, the language that had grown up between people who had no other common tongue, stitched together from necessity across 8 years. He told each man the same thing. The contracts had expired. He had a plan. He needed one more person. He was going to the governor. He told each man what the risk was and did not minimize it. He had seen what happened to men who ran and were caught. He was not offering safety. He was offering a direction and a reason. Both men said yes without hesitation, which told Francisco everything he needed to know about whether he had chosen correctly. The night before, he could not sleep. He lay in the hut that had been his home for 8.5 years and listened to the colony breathe and tried to keep his mind on the specific practical things. The route, the water crossings, Lambius's tendency toward the impulsive, the exact sequence of what he would say to the sentry at St. Augustine's gate. When his mind moved toward the other things, he brought it back. He was a man who had survived 9 years in this place by not letting the large things in all at once. You let them in one nail at a time. The children were asleep behind him in the dark. He could hear them breathing. The particular small breathing of children in deep sleep. The sound he had listened for every night for years as a kind of proof. A daily accounting that they were still here and still his. Margarita was awake. He knew without looking. He had not told her, not in words. He had told her in the way a carpenter tells a piece of wood what it is going to become. By working around it slowly, shaping the space until the form was unmistakable even before the final cut. She had known for days. She had not asked questions, because there are questions a woman does not ask when she understands that the answer is already made, and the asking would only add weight to what the person she loves is already carrying. He lay still and breathed and listened to the colony breathe around him. 9 years. He had come here at 21 with a contract and a set of promises and the particular hope that belongs to young men who have not yet learned how promises and contracts behave when the power in the room belongs entirely to one party. He had built a house for the man who held his contract. He had built drainage canals for the field that had no end. He had buried neighbors without markers in the sandy soil that kept no record. He had stood in a cleared field and watched 2 men hang from a gallows built with good joinery and driven his thumbnail into his palm and gone back to work. He had had 2 children in this place. He thought about Juana, 2 months old, who had signed nothing and promised nothing, and arrived in this world in a palmetto frond hut because he had put himself here in the service of a man in London who would never learn his name. He thought about the boy and the overheard words. If these people knew their rights, he knew his rights. In the hour before first light, when the colony was at its deepest sleep and the overseers had not yet begun their morning rounds, he rose quietly from the mat and stood in the dark and looked at his sleeping children one last time, pressing the image into the specific place in his mind where he kept things he could not afford to lose. And he picked up his boots and moved to the door. The mosquitoes found him before first light.